For more than 3,000 years, the golden face of Tutankhamun stared silently into the darkness of his tomb, polished, perfect, untouched, and almost completely misunderstood. When a team of scientists finally pointed a modern scanner at that radiant gold, the picture they retrieved did not simply confirm what Egyptology had assumed for a century. It split the mask in two. Beneath the surface that the world has photographed, that has toured the globe, that has come to symbolize Egypt itself, another face was hiding. A second layer of gold, slightly different in color, slightly different in composition, and almost certainly holding the memory of a different ruler. 3,300 years of burial had done nothing to soften that secret. The scan exposed it for the first time, and everything scholars thought they knew about the most famous object ever to leave ancient Egypt has been tipped, ever so slightly, onto another track. The story of how we got to that scan begins in November of 1922 when Howard Carter, an English archaeologist, working on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, squeezed through a narrow stone doorway into a tomb that no human being had entered in more than 3 millennia. The tomb, designated KV-62, was modest by royal standards, far smaller than the great halls carved for earlier pharaohs, yet what it gave up over the next several seasons would outshine every grander tomb in the Valley of the Kings. On October 28, 1925, after a slow and meticulous excavation of 3 nested coffins, Carter's team lifted the lid of the innermost coffin, a coffin of solid beaten gold, and there it was, a young king's face framed in striped gold and lapis lazuli, with the broad collar of a god resting on his shoulders, the striped Nemes headdress flowing down to his chest, and the curved plaited beard of Osiris, god of the afterlife, hanging from his chin. Carter wrote in his diary that the mask's gaze was turned straight upward to the heavens, and that its expression was, in his word, placid. The world has been looking at that expression ever since. Carter removed the mask from the tomb in December of 1925 and carried it, with extraordinary care, 635 kilometers north to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it would become the single most recognized object from ancient Egypt, the emblem of a civilization, the photograph on the cover of every popular book about the boy king. It rests there today, transferred in recent years to the Grand Egyptian Museum, where it is displayed surrounded by the full treasure of the tomb for the first time in history. The mask measures 54 centimeters tall, weighs just over 10 kilograms, and is inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian, carnelian, amazonite, turquoise, and faience. The blue stripes of the headcloth are colored glass. The eyes are quartz with obsidian pupils. The eyebrows and eye sockets are deep blue lapis. The ears are pierced for earrings. It is, by any measure, a masterpiece. For most of the past century, both scholars and the public made a simple assumption about that masterpiece. It was made for Tutankhamun, and that was the end of it. The name in the cartouche on the shoulder was his. The face looked like his. The boy king was a minor pharaoh who died young, and the mask seemed the perfect, if slightly oversized, reflection of his brief reign. Yet when the mask was studied scientifically, the simple story began to crack. In the early 2000s, a team of Japanese and Egyptian researchers, working under the direction of Professor Masayo Uda of Waseda University, used a technique called X-ray, fluorescence, to analyze the metal of the mask without damaging it. What they discovered when they published the results in 2007 was that the gold of the mask was not uniform. The main body of the mask, the foundation hidden beneath the polished surface, was an alloy of roughly 23 karat gold, alloyed with a small amount of copper to make the metal workable. But the surface itself, the thin, glowing skin that reached the eye, was different. The face and the neck were coated with a paler alloy of about 18, 4 carats, giving those features a slightly lighter, almost silver gold sheen. The rest of the mask was plated with a 22, 5 carat alloy, a touch warmer in tone. The differences were subtle enough to be invisible in normal museum lighting, and the surface layer was so thin that it measured only about 30 nanometers thick, a coating equivalent to 1/10,000th the width of a human hair. This result has been interpreted as evidence of at least 2 distinct stages of work. The body of the mask was struck, hammered, shaped, and finished first. Later, a second working of the surface produced the distinctive pale gold of the face. The discrepancy is small. The face alloy is 23. 2 carats, while the rest of the mask is about 23, 5 carats. But in the world of high-end gold work, a difference of 3/10 of a carat, when combined with a different surface plating, looks less like accident and more like judgment. 2 craftspersons, or 2 workshops, or 2 royal patrons may have left their fingerprints on the same object. And that, properly understood, is what people mean when they speak of a second layer hidden beneath the surface. There is, in a literal scientific sense, a second layer of gold hiding in this mask. But there is also a second layer in a different, more troubling sense. Several scholars have argued, on independent grounds, that the mask was not made for Tutankhamun at all. The most fully developed version of that argument was set out in 2015 by the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves in an article titled The Gold Mask of Ankeperur Neferneferuaten, published in the Journal of the Arizona Egyptian Studies Association. Reeves proposed that the mask was originally made for Tutankhamun's immediate predecessor on the throne, a female pharaoh whose throne name was Ankeperur and whose personal name was Neferneferuaten. Many Egyptologists now identify Neferneferuaten with the famous Queen Nefertiti, the wife of the heretic king Akhenaten and the stepmother of the boy king. Reeves argued that the differences between the face and the rest of the mask are not the result of two finishing stages, but of two separate commissions. The headcloth, the ears, the shoulders, and the structural core of the mask were made originally as a portrait of Neferneferuaten. Sometime later, perhaps after the unexpected death of Tutankhamun, that core was reworked to receive a new face, that of the boy king, hammered separately and fitted onto the existing structure. The result is a hybrid, a new king's face bolted onto an old king's frame. Reeves did not arrive at this conclusion on metal analysis alone. He cited the pierced ears as a second independent clue. In nearly every surviving Egyptian royal portrait, pierced ears are reserved for women and children. Adult male rulers are almost always shown with closed, sealed earlobes. Yet the ears of Tutankhamun's mask are clearly pierced, as though designed to receive an earring, even though no earring is currently fixed in the place. A fully grown male pharaoh about to be sealed into the most important tomb of his reign would, on this logic, almost never have been portrayed with open earlobes. The piercing, in Reeves's view, was inherited from the original female recipient. The argument was taken up and sharpened by Professor Joanne Fletcher of the University of York, an Egyptologist who has spent decades working on the Amarna period and on questions of royal identity in the late 18th dynasty. Fletcher pointed out, in a 2022 documentary for History Hit, that when one looks closely at the mask, the dimpling at the center of each earlobe, the place where a stud or ring would rest, is unmistakable. She went further, suggesting that the proportions of the face and neck are subtly broader than those of the standard boy king portraits found elsewhere in the tomb. Combined with the alloy difference, the earlobe difference becomes, in her view, more than coincidence. This is not a settled matter. Christian Eckmann, the German metal conservator who led the restoration of the mask in 2015 after the famous beard incident, examined the object closely with a microscope and concluded that there is no evidence of two distinct pieces of metal having been joined to make the face. The disagreements among specialists are real and unresolved, and responsible writing on the subject has to say so. The presence of two compositional layers inside the metal is established by X-ray analysis. The interpretation of those layers as evidence of two different royal patrons is a strong and serious theory, but a theory nonetheless. What can be said without dispute is that the mask, as it has come down to us, is the product of at least two stages of work, and that at least one scholar of international standing has argued, on the basis of metallurgical and iconographic evidence, that one of those stages belonged to a prior reign. The mask's other hidden content is, in its own way, just as striking. The back of the mask and its shoulders carry an inscription in Egyptian hieroglyphs, 10 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines that, on first glance, looks like a simple dedication to Tutankhamun. It does identify the dead king by his throne name, Nefertiti, and by his birth name, Tutankhamun. But it also contains, in the right-hand column, a complete protective spell from the Book of the Dead, chapter 151, a spell that first appeared on royal masks during the Middle Kingdom 5 centuries earlier. The text addresses the mask itself as a divine being, saying, in effect, that the right eye of the dead king is the night boat of the sun god, that the left eye is the day boat, that the forehead belongs to Anubis, the nape of the neck to Horus, the locks to Ptah Sokar. The dead king is asked to see through the mask, to be guided by it, to smite the confederates of Seth on behalf of the Ennead of gods in the great castle of the prince, which is in Heliopolis. Behind the polished image of the boy king, then, sits a religious machinery far older than the 18th dynasty, and far more elaborate than any casual viewer would LD suspect. A careful look at that back of the mask in 2015, after a fresh photographic campaign undertaken in cooperation with the Factum Foundation, a Spanish conservation group that specializes in high-resolution recording of endangered heritage, revealed something else. Beneath the hieroglyphs of Tutankhamun's name, there appear to be faint traces of an earlier cartouche. The interpretation of those traces is disputed. Reeves reads them as the eroded signature of Ankeperur Neferneferuaten, partially erased and then recut in Tutankhamun's name. Eckmann reads them as a recutting in the same king's name at a different point in his reign. Other scholars have read the marks as natural wear, but whether one accepts the dramatic reading or the cautious one, the back of the mask is no longer the simple, single-purpose object Egyptology once took it for. It, too, hides a second layer. Perhaps the most visible reminder that this object is not what it appears comes from an entirely different kind of event. On August 24th, 2014, while the mask was being lowered from its display case in T, the Egyptian Museum for routine cleaning, the plaited gold beard that hangs from its chin, nearly 2.5 kilograms of gold inlaid with blue glass, the unmistakable ornament of Osiris, broke away from the chin. The piece fell, and museum workers, in a panic more than a decision, reattached the beard with quick-drying epoxy. The repair was visible from across the gallery. The glue set too quickly, and the beard sat noticeably off-center. Worse, when the error was discovered in January of 2015, conservators found that the epoxy had seeped along the join and had to be scraped away. The scraping left small but permanent scratches in the gilt of the chin. The damage became a public scandal. 8 employees of the museum were referred for trial in January 2016, and a former director of the museum was among those disciplined. A German-Egyptian team, led by Christian Ekman and including a specialist from the Rathgen Research Laboratory in Berlin, was brought in to set the record straight. They removed the epoxy residue, which had partially hardened into a crust across the join, and reattached the beard using beeswax, a natural adhesive used by the ancient Egyptians themselves in exactly this kind of work. The atmospheric effect of the change was striking. The mask on display today is closer to the artifact than anything the museum has shown since 1944, when the beard was first reattached with a wooden dowel. The 2015 restoration also removed decades of grime and finger oil from the gold, restoring the surface to a glow that is, in photographs, almost unsettlingly bright. When the mask was first unwrapped in 1925, the beard had already separated from the chin. Carter's team reattached it on the spot with a wooden dowel, a method that kept the piece in roughly the right place for 70 years. That method, like the epoxy fix, was imperfect. The archaeological record of the mask, in other words, is not only a record of ancient craft, but also a record of 100 years of human error and repair. Every visitor who has stood in front of the mask has, until very recently, been looking at a slightly wrong version of it. The X-ray and metallurgical work of the past 2 decades has not been the only modern scientific engagement with the tomb. In January of 2005, Tutankhamun's mummy itself was removed from its display in the tomb and subjected to a CT scan, an event broadcast live to an international audience. The scan allowed accurate forensic reconstruction of the king's body, confirmed a complex of injuries including a badly broken left leg, and suggested that death had come, most likely, from infection, following that injury combined with malaria. The scan also revealed that Tutankhamun was only ever embalmed once, contrary to the early idea that he had been prepared twice. None of this changes the mask, but it changes the context in which the mask must be read. The boy king, who needed this work to be done in haste, who died unexpectedly from a broken leg on a foreign battlefield, did not necessarily have the time, the budget, or the artisans to commission a brand new, from-scratch portrait of himself in gold. A rush to find a finished piece and a craft of adaptation must have been a real possibility. That possibility is now the most important disputed question in the study of the mask. 3 lines of evidence are slowly converging. The metallurgical evidence shows 2 layers of goldwork with subtly different alloying. The iconographic evidence shows pierced ears, a feature almost always reserved for children and women on royal portraits. The textual evidence shows what may be faint ghosts of an earlier royal name under the cartouches of Tutankhamun. Taken individually, each line of evidence is ambiguous. Taken together in the view of Reeves and Fletcher, they form a single consistent picture. The mask is a composite, and a portrait of the much more famous Queen Nefertiti lives hidden inside it. The wider Egyptological community is unconvinced, at least so far. Several of the leading specialists on Amarna royal succession have suggested that Neferneferuaten was not, in fact, Nefertiti, and that the king for whom the mask was originally intended, if such a king existed, may have been a different ruler entirely. Other scholars see the differences in gold composition as a simple matter of workshop practice, a craft team lighting a new batch of alloy when they ran out, perhaps, or applying a final polish in a different season. Still others accept the 2-layer conclusion, but reject the Nefertiti hypothesis, and argue instead that the modifications within Tutankhamun's own reign, perhaps when he moved his capital from Amarna back to Memphis, are sufficient to explain the data. To say that the question is settled would be to say something not supported by the present state of the published evidence. What can be said is that the mask, when held up to the light of modern instruments, behaves like an object that has lived more than one life. Its gold has the fingerprints of multiple workshops. Its ears have the markings of a wearer's identity carefully hidden in plain sight. Its inscriptions carry the eroded ghost of a cartouche that may, or may not, belong to an earlier and greater ruler. The mask is a palimpsest, and the discovery of that palimpsest is not, in the end, a reduction of the object to a lesser thing. It is, on the contrary, an enlargement. The mask that the world imagines, The perfect single portrait of the boy king becomes, on the evidence of the scans and the readings of the texts, a window into a far more turbulent political moment, the moment at the very end of the Amarna heresy, when the throne of Egypt passed from the radical religious revolution of Akhenaten and Nefertiti to the conservative restoration of the boy Tutankhamun, and when the materials of royal memory had to be carried across the break in whatever form was available. That the master craftsmen of the Valley of the Kings were able to make the transition invisible to the naked eye for more than 3,000 years is itself a testament to their skill. That modern science has at last found the seams is a testament to ours. And the second layer, whether it turns out to be the portrait of a queen, the signature of a workshop, or simply the mark of a different finishing season, is no longer buried with the king. It has been read. For more than 3,000 years, the golden face of Tutankhamun stared silently into the darkness of his tomb, polished, perfect, untouched, and almost completely misunderstood. When scientists finally pointed a modern scanner at that radiant gold, the picture that came back did not confirm what Egyptology had assumed for a century. It split the mask in two. Beneath the surface, the world has photographed. The surface that has toured the globe, that has come to symbolize Egypt itself, another face was hiding. A second layer of gold, slightly different in tone, slightly different in composition, and almost certainly holding the memory of a different ruler. 3,300 years of burial had done nothing to soften that secret. The scan exposed it for the first time. The story begins in November 1922, when Howard Carter squeezed through a narrow stone doorway into a tomb that no human being had entered in more than 3 millennia. Tomb KV-62 was modest by royal standards, far smaller than the great halls carved for earlier pharaohs. Yet what it gave up over the next several seasons outshines every tomb in the Valley of the Kings. On October 28, 1925, after a slow excavation of 3 nested coffins, Carter's team lifted the lid of the innermost coffin, a coffin of solid beaten gold, and there was the young king's face framed in striped gold and lapis lazuli, the broad collar of a god on his shoulders, the striped Nemes headdress flowing down to his chest, the curved plaited beard of Osiris hanging from his chin. The world has been looking at that expression ever since. Carter removed the mask in December 1925 and carried it 635 kilometers north to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It rests there now, transferred to the Grand Egyptian Museum, where it is displayed surrounded by the full treasure of the tomb for the first time in history. The mask measures 54 centimeters tall, weighs just over 10 kilograms, and is inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian, carnelian, amazonite, turquoise, and faience. The blue stripes are colored glass. The eyes are quartz with obsidian pupils. The ears are pierced. It is by any measure a masterpiece. For most of the past century, both scholars and the public assumed this masterpiece was made for Tutankhamun, period. The cartouche on the shoulder said so. The face looked like him. Yet, when studied scientifically, the picture began to crack. In the early 2000s, a Japanese-Egyptian team, led by Professor Masayo Uda of Waseda University, used X-ray fluorescence to analyze the metal without damage. They published in 2007. What they discovered was that the gold was not uniform. The main body of the mask was roughly 23 karat gold, alloyed with copper to make it workable. Yet the surface itself was different. The face and the neck were coated with a paler 18. 4 karat alloy, giving those features a slightly lighter, almost silver gold sheen. The rest was plated with a 22. 5 karat alloy. The differences were subtle enough to vanish in normal museum lighting. The surface layer was about 30 nanometers thick, 1/10,000th the width of a human hair. That is the literal scientific meaning of the second layer hidden in this mask. But there is also a second layer in a more troubling sense. Several scholars have argued the mask was simply not made for Tutankhamun at all. In 2015, the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published the gold mask of Ankheperure Nefertiti in the Arizona Egyptian Studies Journal. He proposed that the mask was originally made for Tutankhamun's immediate predecessor, a female pharaoh whose throne name was Ankheperure and whose personal name was Nefertiti. Many Egyptologists now identify her with the famous Queen Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten and the stepmother of the boy king. Reeves argued the differences between the face and the rest of the mask were not 2 finishing stages, but 2 separate commissions. The headcloth, ears, shoulders, and structural core were originally made as a portrait of Nefertiti. After the unexpected death of Tutankhamun, that core was reworked to receive a new face, hammered separately and fitted onto the existing structure. A hybrid, a new king's face fitted onto an old king's frame. The pierced ears were a second clue. In nearly every surviving royal portrait, pierced ears belong to women and children. Adult male rulers almost always show sealed earlobes. Yet the ears of Tutankhamun's mask are clearly pierced. A fully grown male pharaoh, on this logic, would not have been portrayed with open earlobes. The piercing, in Reeves's view, was inherited from the original female recipient. Professor Joanne Fletcher of the University of York took the argument further in 2022, noting that the dimpling at the center of each earlobe, the place an earring would sit, is unmistakable, and that the proportions of the face and neck seem subtly broader than in standard boy-king portraits. Combined with the alloy differences, the earlobe becomes more than coincidence. Not everyone is convinced. Christian Ekman, the German metal conservator who led the restoration in 2015, examined the mask under a microscope and found no evidence that the face was composed of a different piece of metal joined to the rest. The disagreement among specialists is real. The presence of two compositional layers is established. The interpretation that they belong to two royal patrons is a strong theory, but a theory nonetheless. What can be said without dispute is that the mask, as it has come down to us, is the product of at least two stages of work, and that at least one scholar of international standing has argued, on metallurgical and iconographic grounds, that one of those stages belonged to a prior reign and most likely to a queen. The mask's hidden content is striking in another direction. The back and shoulders carry an inscription in hieroglyphs that, on first glance, looks like a simple dedication. It does identify Tutankhamun by throne name Nebkheperure and birth name Tutankhamun, but it also contains a complete protective spell from the Book of the Dead, chapter 151, a spell first placed on royal masks during the Middle Kingdom 5 centuries earlier. The text addresses the mask as a divine being, declaring the right eye the night boat of the sun god, the left eye the day boat, the forehead the place of Anubis, the nape the place of Horus. Behind the polished image of the boy king sits a religious machinery far older than the 18th dynasty. The scan that exposed the second layer did not, in the end, diminish the mask. It enlarged it. What was once taken for a single perfect portrait of a minor boy king is now, on the evidence, a window into a far more turbulent political moment, the moment at the end of the Amarna heresy, when the throne of Egypt passed from the radical religious revolution of Akhenaten and Nefertiti to the conservative restoration of the boy Tutankhamun, and when the materials of royal memory had to be carried across the break in whatever form was available. That ancient craftsmen made that transition invisible for 33 centuries is a testament to their skill. That modern science has at last found the seams is a testament to ours. If you value careful work that pulls ancient stories apart without losing their wonder, subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a new investigation. Tell us in the comments what you think the second layer really is. A portrait of Nefertiti, a craft signature, or something even harder to imagine. And share this video with a friend who still believes the mask was made for the boy king exactly as he wears it.